Thank you for the introduction. My name is Josh James. I, in just a moment, will be part of a panel that will be discussing how to enhance the power of Power BI. Really glad you're here with us. Welcome to Enhancing the Power of Power BI, a panel discussion with a few JourneyTEAM consultants. My name is Josh James.
I'm Jordan Johnson.
And I'm Nathan Gillian.
And, you know, during coronavirus days, it's a little bit tougher to have a true forum.
It's hard to meet in person.
It's hard to meet in person. And really, the way that we're going to do this is just kind of as if people were asking questions. It's kind of like we're just going to provide tip after tip of how to enhance the power of Power BI. First, we're going to start off with some pro tips for Power Query. If you're not familiar with what Power Query is if you click on
Transform
data. This will take you to Power Query. This is Power Query within a desktop file. You can also access Power Query within a data flow, which is Power Query inside the service or in the cloud or at app.powerbi.com. First off, there are a lot of big transformations that are really, really slow. Whether you're in a data flow or whether you're in your desktop file, they tend to be really, really slow. Ideally, you want to do those kind of things in your data source. So back in your SQL database or whatever data source you have, hopefully you can do something like that. If you can't, and you really need to do this in Power Query, then I strongly suggest doing it in a data flow so that it doesn't affect your refresh times of your desktop file, just because it can really slow down your dev experience. You want to avoid joining large tables in the query editor. Same reason, or in Power Query for the same reason, it can be really, really slow. Again, if this is something you need to do in Power Query, doesn't mean you can't do it. Just if you do, put it in a data flow again, so that you can have the refresh happen in the cloud at a time when you're not necessarily using when you're not developing reports, so it doesn't slow you down. Don't load intermediate queries to memory. So intermediate queries, another way to say this is like helper tables, reference tables, tables that you use to do your transformations, but you don't necessarily need to see at the end. You're going to want to make sure you don't load those. You do that by disabling the load or by unchecking enable load within Power Query.
If we go to transform data with the Power Query editor, like Josh was talking about, you'd want to disable load. So right here, I've got an error because I'm not pointing to the correct file. If I don't want that to mess up my refresh, I can right click on this. And notice there's this enable load. If I click on that, it disables the load. It says, oh, you might lose some data. That's fine. And notice how it's now italicized. Okay? That means that it's disabled and it won't be loaded into the model.
Another tip is to use query folding. Over here on the right side, you can see these applied steps. This is one of the coolest things about Power Query is that you can actually see every single step you take. Not only can you see it, but you can actually go to it and experience each step. So this is great. Hopefully it gives beginners a little less fear as they try to figure out Power Query, because if you make a mistake, it's just going to be right there anyways. You can see exactly what you did. You can delete it later. You can manipulate it later. The way that query folding works is as long as you do it early days. If you're going to do a kind of a heavier transformation, you want to do it as an earlier step, because if you're coming from the right source, if you're pulling the data from the right source, it'll push that step onto the source instead of having Power Query do all the work. It would let your source do the work instead, therefore speeding up your Power Query experience and also not requiring as many CPUs or engaging your computer as much.
Yeah, let me connect to SQL right here. SQL is, if you connect to Excel, you're not going to be able to query fold. Let's just get that out of the way. Okay, so I'm connecting to, let's see, this sales order detail table. It's just some demo data from Microsoft. So I'm going to connect to this and just show you how query folding can work, how you know that query folding is happening, because it's not super obvious. So I'm going to connect to this SQL table, and you'll notice, like Josh was saying, we've got the source right here. It tells you my database, or the server, the SQL server and the database. I'm just hosting a demo on Azure. I navigate to that table, and now let's say I only want to pull in the top 100.
Looking for
keep rows. So I want to come up here. I'm going to keep, say, top, just like a typical, let's do 1,000. Keep top 1,000 rows. kind of like select top 1,000 rows that you would do in query. If I hit OK on that, notice how I get this step over here. So I'm going to come over here to my keep first rows, and you'll notice if I right click on this, notice this view native query button. That only shows up if query folding is possible or it's being used, right? It's actually being used. So I click on that, you'll notice there's now a SQL query right here that does exactly what our Power Query steps are doing. So it's not using my computer's CPU, like Josh was saying, it's pushing that back to the Azure database and using the Azure SQL database resources to run this query, and then sends me only those 1,000 rows instead of the 50,000, and then filtering it down to just the top 1,000. So that has a lot of advantages, especially if you pull in data that you will then need to filter. You don't need all of it. If you are going to filter it, query folding can save a lot of processing power and time.
And again, you want to do this early in your applied steps, because there's certain steps that if you apply, break that connection. You can no longer go back to the source. So if you do like a more major transformation like merging or appending, anything that's going to reference a table outside of the table that you're specifically referencing here is going to break the opportunity to go back and query fold. So just be aware of that, and think of those transformations that you want to do early on, so you can make sure that you push it to the source.
Perfect.
I think something else that goes right along with that is just, in general, when you're filtering your data sets down, you want to do filtering down before you do major transformations at all anyways, right?
Yeah.
Because you don't want to go in and modify 7 different columns and add calculated columns and then filter out half your data set, because that's just wasted resources.
Exactly.
Parameters are a cool thing you can do in Power Query. One way that it can be used is setting up a source as a parameter. And let's say you're working in a dev space with your CRM, like Dynamics, for example, and you want to switch it now to either a test space or to prod. Then using your parameter, you can just switch a parameter and automatically, boom, you've switched the source of all of your queries.
I've got that right here. This Power Query uses this parameter. I've got a file path actually as my parameter. This is not recommended, and we'll talk about that more later. I don't like referencing Excel files on my computer, but it makes it easy for demos. So just quick caveat there. But you can see here that I've got a file path, and this file path parameter I use in all of my queries right here. If I go to the source, you'll notice on the source I have my file path parameter right here. It says file contents, file path, and then the name of the file. And so like Josh said, really easy, just change this parameter, boom, and the data's there.
You will have to get into the M just a little bit, M being the language of Power Query.
Yeah.
But this is very straightforward compared to most manipulations of M, I would say. As you saw, it's really easy to reference other queries within a query. It's really a matter of just writing the word itself, the name of the query. Other cool tips, using keep errors. Keep errors is kind of a hidden spot. If you'll go back to Power Query, it'll be awesome. So keep errors is kind of in a hidden spot within Power Query. So up here at the top left, if you hit that and click keep errors, you can also use this to keep duplicates, different things like that. Thankfully, you don't have any errors, but if you did have errors, it would filter it just to those rows that have errors. So it's a really easy way to first find out if you have errors, because sometimes Power Query doesn't pick up all the errors, or visually doesn't show you the errors until you hit refresh or until you try to save it.
And that's because it only does the top 1,000 rows as a preview, right? So keep that in mind. If you have more than 1,000 rows of your data, it's only showing you the preview of the top 1,000.
That's exactly right. Very cool. And now last, so keep errors, nice tip, good to know. It's worth doing it essentially on every one of your queries before you save and push it forward, just so you can really catch whether you have errors or not. And I not only just catch them whether they exist, but actually see what's going on there, see which columns are having the issues. And then last, Power Query has these really cool views that you can set up that will allow you to get really good insights into your columns. One example here, these are the options you can set up. So if you go to the View tab within Power Query, You can set up the column distribution. You can see the column profile. You can see the column quality. Column quality will identify if you have how much is valid, how much is an error, how much is empty, how many of your rows, I should say, a percentage of your rows are each of those things.
Let's go to a bigger table. If I go to my sales table and have this on, this table has a bit more data. It might take a little bit to load, but I'm pretty sure that the valid, error, and empty percentages are not just based on the 1,000, right? Aren't they based on
I think
everything?
I think that
you
goes
have
to
it
the
set up.
full.
It's the default is that it's just 1,000.
Mhm.
You can set it up to be your entire table. Something to be leery of course.
Right.
Because if it is a really big table, that's a lot to load.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the advantages of Power Query, right, is it does just grab that top 1,000. So those views are very, very cool. And there you go. There's some cool tips from Power Query.
Perfect. Let's run through some DAX shortfalls to avoid right now. So I'm going to run through 3 calculated tables, why to use them, why not to use them, and how you can use other things instead of calculated tables. The difference between null and blank text, because they are not the same in DAX. And then I'm going to run through calculated columns and versus measures and see why you would want to use a measure versus a calculated column, just when it comes to optimizing your DAX. So let's jump right into calculated tables and file size. So if we run to this table right here. Okay, so what I've got here is a measure. I'm measuring just some financial data over a period of time, but I want to look at, say, the previous month and then the next previous month. So the last 0 to 30 days and then 31 to 60 days. And so in order to do this, it's really easy to get the last month in Power BI, but I had to write some custom DAX in order to get the last 31 to 60 days. And it's easy to do that if you want to reference just today as always the day that you look back to. But say I want to see the last 30 days and the last 31 to 60 days from a month ago. So looking at the report as if it was September 20th or 21st, 2020. As you can see here, I've made these measures so that they can change based on whatever date I have selected. And so, like you can see right here, I'm looking at this as of July 6, 2019. The numbers change based on that. Okay, and so the way that I'm doing this is by creating calculated tables, but then using those calculated tables inside of a measure as a table variable. And there are a couple advantages to that. The first one being that you don't have a table just sitting there in your data model doing nothing. The other being that variables are stored in a measure, and that takes up a lot less space in your file. Measures only store the formula as opposed to storing the actual data when you create a calculated table. So you can see in my measures right here, let's go to my table variables. So I've got this measure called previous month's sales. And you can see I've got these variables in here: max selected date, max selected table, end day, start date, dates included. And so for each of these, this first one is just a value, it's just the measure value, but then this next one, this max selected table, that is actually a table, a calculated table inside of a table variable. And that I then use as a table variable to reference my end day, my start day, and then grabbing these dates between as well and using those inside of my calculate. I also have the calculated table of what this would look like right here. You can see I've got this is a calculated table. It's got the same DAX, the same exact DAX, it's just stored as a calculated table instead. And so I like doing creating a calculated table like this so I can see in my table view what my measure is using. So I can come here, select the max selected table, and I can see that is the date that is being selected, right? So I have to have that single date stored as a table instead of a scalar value so that I can use it in DAX functions that require a table as an input, okay? And so this allows me to see that. Now, another disadvantage of using a calculated table is you'll notice here, this is always going to be 10/21/2020, even though when I change my date range right here on my table, even though I change this, the calculated table isn't going to change, right? Until, well, actually it won't change unless we go into the next year, and then it just changes day by day as the data refreshes, as opposed to when I change my slicer, so it's not dynamic. And so that's another reason not to use a calculated table and to use a table variable. We'll talk more about table variables in the DAX class and other things. So if you're interested, be sure to sign up for the DAX course that we're teaching the last day of the Business Tech Summit. So keep that in mind. Let's move on now to null and blank text. That cell right there is blank text, okay? It's just a blank text, whereas the bottom one is just null, okay? When I pull this into Power BI, so you can see here, I've got two different measures and they show two different values. But before we even go to the measures, if we look here at my is blank versus null, everything looks the same, right? Visually, you can't tell until you write some measures. Let me show you those measures that I've written. I've got a count of units with the blank. So I write here, I have not equal to blank text. Now blank text, not null, okay? And so you can see here that I have 4 values that are not equal to blank text. If I change the DAX to be looking for not is blank of that same column, I get 5. And so the difference here is that that blank text doesn't count as a blank cell with this is blank DAX function or formula. And so there are 5 cells that have data, even though one of them visually doesn't appear to have data, and there's only one true null. Now, this depends on the data that you're connecting to, but just be aware that there is a difference between blank or null and blank text. Keep that in mind, because you could get wrong counts if you don't account for that. Moving on to the next, we've got calculated columns. Add to the size of your model measures, not so much. Why is it even important?
Well, I would say it's, depending on how much data you're working with, it's easy for Power BI files to get really unwieldy. And so that can be a problem, on a simple measure just for collaborative efforts. If you have a 8 gigabyte file that you're trying to work with and share with other people or do things like that, then that's going to take quite a bit of work to move that around. But there's other implications too.
Yeah, Jordan alluded to it, but one of the reasons why you want to keep it smaller, the less data you have that you're forcing DAX to scan through, the faster it's going to be able to do it, right? It's just a matter of numbers. Like if you have to look at 1,000,000 rows instead of 1,000 rows, then it's going to be longer. And the same thing is the case if you have more columns than necessary when you're using your table functions or you're doing different things like that, there's just more to look at. And so the more you can reduce that, the more performant your DAX is going to be.
Exactly.
And your model generally.
Yeah.
All your relationships going on with DAX.
Exactly right. And in addition to those things that you mentioned, calculated columns actually add to the data size. So when Jordan was talking about your file size gets bigger, it's because a calculated column actually adds data to your model, right? And so if you have 1,000,000 rows and you have one calculated column, that adds 1,000,000 data points to your data model. And so just to show you an example of this, I've got, if you look at these top 2, Power BI files right here, I've got a calculated column one and a measure one. And then there's the raw data. So the raw data has no DAX in it at all. Okay, but the calculated column has a calculated column that does the same exact math to find the measure that I'm looking for, or to return the data I'm looking for, and then the measure does the same thing as well, just in a measure form instead of a calculated column form. And you can see here the file size is pretty different. It's about 500 kilobytes, which is not huge, you might be saying, but this is also a really simple data model. In fact, let me show you what that looks like. If you look down at the bottom here, I've got that 7,200,000 rows here, okay? And when I add a calculated column, it's adding 7,235,490 data points. And so that increased the file size by 500 kilobytes. Now, this is a single table. I don't know anybody. I don't think I ever will know anybody. I don't think you have ever worked with a client or anybody who has had a single data table in their model. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the world is much.
If there is just one, it's gonna be really wide.
Really big, right? Exactly, and that's not optimized for other reasons.
Right.
But I don't think that's ever going to be the case. So just think about 500 kilobytes for one table. Expand that to however many tables you might have. You're starting to maybe run into some problems here. And not saying calculated columns are bad, but just use them for categorizing data and use measures for actually calculating numbers.
And best practice would be if you do want a categorical column, which makes sense because it's the only real way to slice in Power BI. You want to do that in Power Query because compression occurs as the data is loaded into Power BI. So back when you're in Power Query, you do all this transformation work, and then when you press close and apply, that's when the compression occurs, and it goes into Power BI for DAX to do its fun and work with it. And so if you could do that pre-DAX, then you're going to get all the compression benefits. So you'll get smaller file size if you do have to have those columns.
Right. And these are kind of nitpicky, but they're important, especially once you start getting into data in the real world, which hopefully we're
Or
all.
lots of data, or if you're going to be smart and build larger data sets you can then reference with lots of reports rather than building lots of data sets, which is something we'll talk about soon.
Exactly.
That sounds great. Okay, we're going to jump into integer joins versus text joins. When I'm talking joins, I'm talking about what makes your relationship. So when you're looking at your Power BI model, what you're linking to, right? What your keys are, if you will, between tables. Really, the idea here is I want you to use integer joins whenever you can. The reason being, there's a couple of reasons that I want to cover. One is integers compress a whole lot better. We're going to get into compression a little bit more later, but conceptually, when we talk about having smaller models, more lean models, that it's easier for DAX to jump around and do its fun work within. The more compressed, the more small, the better you are off. And integers compress a lot better. In fact, text, the way that Power BI or the VerdPack engine compresses text is it essentially converts it into an integer. It makes a dictionary reference to an integer for each of your text values, which indicates a little bit just how much better integers are. But also integers, you don't have to go through that. DAX doesn't have to go through that process, or the VerdPack engine doesn't have to go through the process of dictionaryizing each and every one of your text values within your column. And then when it comes to integers, you just decrease your chance for errors. I don't know if you've experienced this dealing with text values, but there's a lot of ways that you can have two text values not match up. One is the capitalization might be off, might have different spaces, and then the worst and most nefarious is invisible values that you just, for whatever reason, can't be seen. And that's something that text can do to you, and that messes up joins pretty good. If you do have to use text, in some cases you may have to, like a GUID, for example, those are text, for better or worse, and they're also really massive. If you can avoid GUIDs, do it. But if you have to use text, strongly suggest going into Power Query, and it's really easy to do these transformations. Make all of your text all or no caps, so you can completely eliminate that potential error, and then use the clean and the trim functions on your text columns prior to your joins.
Now, the reason that Josh was saying that you have to capitalize an M is because M cares about case, whereas DAX does not care about case.
Yeah.
Just keep that in mind.
Okay, using report pages as tooltips. So this is a little GIF that kind of gives you an idea of what can be done. Generally, a tooltip is when you hover over something, you're going to get a black box. You can add some cool information, some added information. This is a feature that allows you to use a report page as a tooltip. So as you can see here, as they're hovering over, he's not just getting a black box, he's literally seeing another visual. This could be an entire page that you do. So this is one visual here that's being done, but it could be an entire page. This is one effective way to do a drill through without having to go to another page, or just to add a cool element to your page that you really can't get any other way.
They're really cool.
It's super cool. I mean, it's a feature that's been around for over a year and a half or so. So it's not necessarily new, but it's something to consider, and it's something that's easy to forget as a great option to give your users kind of a drill through experience without having to actually change pages.
Yeah, there are some performance implications, especially if you put a lot of visuals there. If you do it correctly, the tooltip size is pretty small. If you look at Power BI, the actual page size is pretty small, so you're kind of limited, but you can still show quite a bit of contextual data there.
Strongly suggest using what's called lean reports, or this is kind of the trendy thing to call it right now, is using lean reports. The concept is using one data set and having reports that reference that data set rather than having each report publish a data set with itself, right? So if you've experienced any publishing within Power BI. I'm guessing everyone has. If not, you'll find out soon. If you build a report in Power BI and then you publish it up to the service, if you literally did all the building within that report, like you built your data model, you pulled in all your sources with data query, and then made your relationships, made your visualizations, published it, you're gonna get two things. You're gonna get a data set and a report.
Much like this.
And even though that's really cool, that can be really great because then these data sets are then referenceable within other reports. Oftentimes, my experience with clients is they really just needed one or two data sets. And each of those reports really could just reference that one or those two, rather than having dozens of data sets. There's a few disadvantages that happen from having dozens of data sets unnecessarily. One is every time one of those data sets refreshes, it's hitting your source, right? So you could have 12 data sets hitting the exact same source several times a day. Depending on how your sourcing is done, you could lose a lot of friends back on the data end of your company. Yeah, you could lose some IT friends, which are some powerful people you want on your side. But it also depends on your source. Some sources literally can't handle that. Other sources, it's just annoying and might slow down other people's experiences in different tools or within Power BI, whatever it might be. So by minimizing the amount of data sets you have, you're minimizing the amount of queries you're sending back to these data sources. Also, by having just one data set referenced by a lot of your reports, you can reuse all your measures. So in each of these reports, you don't have to keep rewriting your measures. You also don't have to keep rebuilding your models. I've had clients who every time they start a report, they have to re-import all their data. They have to reset up all their relationships, which may or may not be a big deal. I mean, a lot of people are just pulling in a few Excel spreadsheets, but it's still just another annoyance that you just don't have to deal with, right? And so if you just had one data set that you reference with your Power BI reports, you won't have to worry about that. And then last but not least is your workspace is just gonna be a whole lot cleaner. There's just nothing worse than trying to find things and have your workspace be totally cluttered with a whole lot of other data sets or anything like that. So just a nice way to streamline the entire dev experience and user experience. It's just to use lean data sets.
And remember too, for those of you that are pro users, which most of you probably are, you're sharing your server node with other people. And so if you have 80 data sets that could be compressed into one, and each of those has a refresh, you're using up their node's resources.
So unkind.
Yeah, that's kind of not nice to other people that are on your node. But even if there was nobody else on your node, that's still using 80 times the power that you need to refresh, just like Josh was talking
And
about.
then even to build on that further, if you are using premium, then you're being cruel to your entire organization potentially, right?
Potentially, yeah.
Because really there's only so many CPUs within your server, within your premium node, which is changing. This is changing. I'm not sure if it's already happened or not, but premium is moving more towards this pro model where it's a shared space, so you can guarantee you have a bigger slice of a bigger pie, I guess you can say. Instead of having one particular node that you can only use the CPUs of, it's expanded to multiples. Still to be understood, this is kind of a new thing, but essentially the way that it has been, if you're working within premium, you only have so many CPUs, right? You only have one server that you're working on, or depending on your tier, so many servers, but still limited to whatever that scope is. And you can only do so many refreshes at a time using those CPUs. So if you're hitting that node over and over and over and over again, just you can do the same refresh that one can do.
It's redundant.
It's very redundant. And quick tips, if you're already deep in, if you've already got tons and tons of data sets,
Let us rescue you.
Here's a
That's
quick
probably
guide.
not good to hear.
There's a quick guide. Haven Consulting came out with this idea. I thought it was a pretty good one. First off, what you need to do is decide on a data set. So if you're literally using the same data set in all these reports, cool, just make sure you have all your measures in one data set. Keep that data set as it was for all of the reports. And then you can go to a previously published report, and instead of starting a whole new report to go through this process, you can go to your fields pane and just delete all your sources in your fields pane. All your visualizations are going to remain, and visualizations just reference within DAX. They'll just reference a table, a measure name, these kind of things. So just delete your sources and then connect to that data set. The thing when you connect to a data set, it must be your only source currently. So you have to make sure you have all your other sources deleted. But once you connect to that data set, as long as it really is the same model that you had previously, then all of your visualizations will just auto-populate, right? So literally all it is just deleting everything in your fields pane, connect to that data set, which is now very, very straightforward. Can you mind if you do a quick demo of this?
Sure.
Nate?
Right.
So
Alright.
you can either click here and get data, or if even to the right of get data,
Oh yeah.
is just Power BI
Oh,
data
Power BI data
sets.
sets right here.
This is how easy they've made it to connect to data sets, because this is best practice, and it's one that wasn't communicated very well by Microsoft early on, so there's a lot of people that are already deep into this. But this is the easiest switch over.
All right, so connecting to this dashboard in a day data set right here. Now, Josh mentioned if you connect to a data set, that can be your only source, but Microsoft Business Applications Summit in April or May this year, they announced that this is changing. You're going to be able to connect to multiple data sets in the same Power BI file.
Very cool.
It's going to be super fun. But, so you can see here, and it has everything in it, all the measures, all the columns, all the transformations. Now notice there is no table view over here anymore. So that's one disadvantage to you, but it's good if you're wanting people to develop in Power BI but not be able to connect directly to your source or to be able to mess with any of your measures, just add to it, add to what you've already built. This is the way to do it.
And then lastly, if you're not already deep into this, if you haven't really started and you haven't already created tons and tons of data sets, then just from the start, just get yourself a good data set. When I get a good data set, generally what I do is I don't use that as a report. So again, when you publish a PBIX file or a desktop file, you'll get a report and a data set. But in those cases, I don't use that as a report. I'll often just delete that report. But in my file, I will create pages that I just use for data validation. And so that PBIX file, that's what I'll be adding my measures to in the future so that I can update my data set to expand its potential for future reports. But again, so you publish that up, and then when you start reports, just make sure you reference that data set. And just some quick tips, you can cross workspaces. So if you're planning to publish in this particular workspace, you can reference a data set in a different workspace. And again, your data set, you can only have one data set as a source right now, or if you're going to use a data set as a source, it must be your only source currently. And then this has already been mentioned by Nathan, but you do not get a data view table or a data view within that report file.
Talking about data modeling and data sets and that kind of thing, let's talk about why you'd want to have a measure, what a measures table is and why you'd want to have a measures table. You'll notice here I've got this measures table where you would normally have the table icon that you see here on like address and customer. I've got this cool little calculator, and while this isn't necessary by any means for you to have, it doesn't make your measures run faster, it just organizes your measures in one place. So I put my measures all in these folders so that I know exactly where to go to find my measures that I'm looking for. Now, you might say, well, to create a measure, you have to right click and then you hit new measure and that's created in that table. And you're right, but measures don't live in a table. Measures are just measures, and that's why you can't have duplicate measure names, even if the measures live in different tables, because when Power BI references these measures, it's not referencing the table and then the measure, it's just referencing the measure. Whereas with a column and table, you reference the table and then the column name. So table name, column name. That's why you can have the same name of a column across different tables, is because it goes table name, then column name. Not so for measures. And so I like putting my measures all in a measures table in order to keep it organized. And because when I win the lottery and leave, I want Josh and Jordan to be able to pick up where I left off, and this really makes that easier because they know, okay, he made a measure table, let's go find it. So you're probably thinking, great, you have one right there, how do I create it? Let's go to a blank file here. On the Home tab in Power BI, there's this Enter Data button in the Data section of the ribbon. When you click on that, we're not going to actually enter any data because we need this to be a blank table. And so I'm just going to name it Measures Table. You're more than welcome to name it whatever you would like, just in the name field down here in the bottom left. Say that, and then I just hit load. You don't need to do any transformations, it's just blank, just a blank table, okay? And these steps need to be followed exactly if you want it to show up as a measures table, okay? Now the measures table, normally your tables in your data model show up on the right in the fields pane in alphabetical order. Of course, whatever you name your measures table. It won't matter if you correctly make it a measures table. It won't matter because we'll put it automatically at the top because it recognizes it as a measure table. Okay, so here I am. I've got this measures table, but you'll notice on the measures table, it's just a blank table. It doesn't have anything in it. So let's create a measure right here. Let's just do a quick measure inside of the is blank. You'll notice now I'm going to show you, this is probably where you're at right now, where you've created a measure inside of another table. So I'm going to create the measure in this table, call this our test measure, and we'll just do a count of the units column. Great. There's our measure. Okay, you click on that measure, you'll notice right here it has a home table. It says is blank first null. That's the table that it lives in. But watch, I can click on that.
No,
I can switch it
No.
to the measures table
you wouldn't.
and nothing changes.
You just
Really, except for where it is. Now you're probably thinking, oh, that calculator icon isn't on that table yet. And you'd be right. There's another step you have to do, and that is you have to hide this blank column. So you just hit hide. And then it does nothing yet. You have to collapse the fields pane and then expand it again, and boom, voila.
Huzzah.
The measures table is at the top now, and it's got that cool little calculator icon, and it's just got measures. So that's how you create a measures table.
All right. So, quick little optimization tip. There's an option in the options menu, go figure, where you can disable the background data. And there's a couple little pictures here that show this, but this is something that may or may not have a big impact performance-wise on your PBIX file, but for some, it really can impact it quite a bit. If Power BI is in the background trying to ping back to your sources to refresh the previews on its own, then that can really have an impact on your performance and how often that happens. It's really simple. You just go to the File menu and press Options, and then that little highlighted section there, the background data, you just deselect that, and then it really will show it. Change the background data refresh option for you.
I found the biggest advantage this could have is in Power Query when you have tons of queries over in your query.
Yeah,
Right, and you're trying to load just one, but there's so many other ones that are loading that
right.
that's when it's going to
Certainly.
make the biggest difference.
Yeah, and going back and touching on having a single data set, that single source of truth, you're really going to start to build up the number of queries that you have in that one data set, and that is when you'll start to notice the big performance impacts. And so this is a great option that Nathan just pulled it up here just to show us. But just checking that box makes it so that Power BI won't automatically in the background try to go back to the source and refresh your previews. So really a good thing to implement for that data set, is particularly the single source of truth like we talked about before.
Cool visualizations that you may not be aware of, just so you have them in your back pocket. This is a bullet chart. I found that a lot of clients want to compare against something, right? Like how well a salesperson is doing against their goals, for example, is a really, really popular one. A bullet chart allows you to do that horizontally. You can do something like this with a column chart with line. I can't remember the exact name of the visual. And you can have, instead of having a contiguous line, you can have it shortened down to just lines for each column. And it looks something like this, but it has to be vertical. And I found that if you're really doing a longer list of salespeople or of whatever you're comparing, scrolling vertically is a whole lot easier than scrolling left or right. And so if you do need to scroll, if you do have more than 4 or 5, then I strongly suggest it. And plus, just bars, oftentimes, they're a little more, they just feel a little bit better when you're doing a list of things. And another cool feature of bullet charts, it wasn't there, you can't see it here, but you can have in the background shades that represent kind of categories of, this is when they're doing well, once you pass $25,000 in sales. This is when you're in trouble, when you're, right? You can have these scales in the background instead of having these lines as it's showing, or with these lines, you can have it show these shades of where things are at in comparison to these larger buckets. Pie charts are the great bane of report developers, or as they should be. If they're not, that's okay. the reality is there is a time and a place. I do support them. It just happens to be a really narrow situation when you should be using pie charts or when it's really hits the right spot. It's overused like crazy. Really, the only time you should be using pie charts is when you're comparing two categories to each other, because then you actually get a really good vibe of the differences. Once you start getting more, it's very, very difficult to actually understand how big the slices are, how different they are in comparison to each other. There are some advantages, but again, it's a really narrow situation when you actually want to use pie charts. And final tip, when your interactions, so the default setting is highlighting. When you click on one visual, it's going to highlight or cross-highlight other visualizations. And pie charts just don't work well with this highlighting. For whatever reason, it tries to capture percentages within a percentage kind of thing. It gets really messed up. Strongly suggest using the filter interaction rather than highlight interaction.
We do support pie though.
I was thinking a crumble cookie, maybe they would have a lot of pies, like just
Oh my goodness,
just
could you
to
imagine?
compare cookie consumption.
Yeah.
I
They
mean,
probably
yeah,
have custom visualizations that look like
They
that.
probably do.
yeah, if you work for a company that sells some sort of food or product that is circular,
If you're a donut company, you must have donut charts. Pie company, you must have pie charts.
and if you're a tree company, tree charts, tree maps.
That's right.
Let's talk about the smart narrative.
Yeah, let's talk about
let's
smart
do that.
narrative. So smart narrative is something you can trigger in your options, and it's this easy to use, right? So all you do is right click on a visual, say summarize, and it's going to give you kind of a textual summarization of what's going on in the visual.
If there's a new feature that they just announced in like the Power BI release that they do every month, it's not showing up anywhere like you see, it's probably in the preview features section, which they update all the time.
Q&A is an AI, also AI visualization within Power BI that can be really, really cool. Not many of my clients have taken advantage of it, but depending on who your end users are, this could be something that a lot of people really enjoy. Essentially, the concept is you get to come in here and you just type in kind of what you're looking for. I want to see, for example, sales by month in 2020, right? And plop, it's just going to give you a visualization that captures that, probably a bar chart, like as seen here. But it is, because it is AI, it might get tripped up. The advantage is you can go into the back end of Q&A and feed it words and tell it what these words mean, right? So you can kind of guide the AI
Your
through
teaching it.
users.
Yeah.
And you can actually see what people are typing in, and so you can kind of guide your word usage based on what your users are actually trying to look for. So it can be really cool, just something to keep in mind, especially as you're thinking about the tech savviness of your users. Some might really appreciate being able to just say, type in and not have to worry about it. And it gives that kind of personalization that's hard to give otherwise.
I'm really interested to see what it's going to say because this is kind of meaningless test data. And so I'm really interested to see what it's going to produce. Oh my goodness, look at
Came up with
this.
a lot.
That's actually not too bad, all considering. Yeah.
Sales trended up.
3,000% increase. Wow. You can tell this is test data, but that's pretty cool.
But yeah, like you can tell from that right there, it gives you kind of this cool view that you can't really get just by looking at a visual. Like that 3,000%, you can't see 3,000% looking at that. After Q&A, we've got a decomposition tree. This was at one point the most requested thing for Power BI to build, and Microsoft listened, which is pretty cool. But essentially with the decomposition tree, you can just understand slices of something, right, at a deeper level. So you can say, I keep using sales and just keep going with it. You can kind of see what influenced sales, or which salespeople, which region had the biggest influence on sales, and you can kind of see it over time. And it uses AI to really build this visual out for you, capture all your percentages for you, do some interesting things that you can't do dynamically otherwise. So decomposition tree, very cool. There's actually companies who had created template apps doing this and were doing very, very well before this came out. So it's a good example that this is highly desired by a lot of people, and it's one that you just need to kind of get trying. Just put it in your report and just start exploring. It's really just a drag and drop to capture each of your slices, so it's really straightforward.
Yeah.
And fun to use.
And you right click on each of these and you can, or I think when you maybe add the plus button on one of those, over on the right, you see those plus buttons. I think when you click on one of those, you can select highest or lowest value, so it helps you explore like causality. I put quotes around that because it's really
Right.
hard to attribute causality,
At
but
least strong
trends, correlations,
Sure.
etc. The decomposite tree makes that really easy.
Definitely.
And then key influencers actually runs regressions in the background, so you kind of set up, hey, what is influencing against sales over this particular amount of time? What is making it go down? What is making it go up? And you can just drag these fields into the visualization. Drag the appropriate fields that you want to be able to see if those are influencing the sales or not. And then it's just going to kind of break it out like this and show you what's influencing that particular field the most. And super, super simple. And regressions aren't something that are really easy to do in Power BI, so this is just a really straightforward way to do a regression and see, again, correlation.
Okay, so another optimization piece is doing something called query reduction. Microsoft added this functionality a while back where you could use a single apply button in the filter pane. That's really, really useful. When you go in, and Nathan, if you want to pull this up inside to give an example. But the concept is that if you're looking at a report where you see lots of visuals, by default, when you check a different filter, all of the visuals will recalculate or
It'll rerun the queries,
reruns the processes to show those visuals. But if you have a lot of visuals that are running lots of measures and there's a lot of things happening behind the scenes, then every time you click on a filter, that you might not necessarily want that to run at that time. There may be 3 or 4 changes in the filter pane that you want to make. And so this functionality allows you the option to go in and select 3 or 4 different filters or to change multiple options and then put an apply button in the filter pane so that you can click apply. And the reason why they call that query reduction is because it takes all of those queries and runs them at once rather than at each individual filter click, sending a new query back and rerunning it. The other aspect is that, and we won't get into this much today, but you can use custom visuals from app source or from third-party developers, and those custom visuals oftentimes will be slower and take longer to refresh as well. And so if you're clicking through and changing filters and you have several of those, or 1 or 2 of those, and along with a lot of the default visuals as well, then you'll start to notice some performance impacts there as well.
Yeah, so right now I've got date. You notice I now have this apply button down here that George was talking about, and until if I select these right here, it's not going to do anything until I hit apply right here. Then once I hit apply, then it will go through and change all the numbers. I select accessories, hit apply. So you're in control essentially of when your filters are applying.
Okay. Strongly suggest you sort your columns within Power Query to make your file size smaller. As we talked about, the more lean your data models are, the more performant your reports are going to be. Just a quick overview of how compression works within Power BI. You can see here this color column. See how it's red, green, red, 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 green, blue, 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 green, right? The way that the VertPack engine compresses data, we talked about this kind of dictionaryizing that it does. So you can see here to the right of sales amount column, there's 1, 2, 1, 1, 1, 2, 3, 3, 3, 3, 2. So again, because this is text, it's dictionaryizing these. But don't be deceived, that doesn't necessarily mean it's fast because it's text, because therefore it's such small integers. No, it has to go through that process of creating, but again, that's an aside. The concept is here, the way that it's stored, you see here on the right where under it says it stores, instead of storing 1, 2, 1, 1, 1, 2, 3, 3, 3, 2, it goes 1, 1, as you see, 1, 2, 3, 1, because there's 3 in a row there, 1, 2, and then 4, 3, because there's 4 3s in a row. So essentially it's compressing, if you will, right? So instead of thinking row by row, if there's several rows of the same value in a row, it'll then compress that into just a little thing to remember. So by sorting your columns, you take full advantage of the way that the VertPack engine compresses, and strongly suggest doing that. In the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about what to think of while you're doing that. So again, you want to do this in Power Query. The reason being, compression occurs as the data comes from Power Query into the desktop file. So you want to do all this kind of stuff over in the Power Query side so you can get that compression. But when you're trying to decide which columns to sort, how to sort, just think through the cardinality of the columns, meaning how many unique values of a column there is. So if you're dealing with a categorical column that all of your rows have just 4 of them, right? There's only 4 unique values, or not really unique because they're across it, but a low cardinality column, if you will. If you sort by that, think about it. You're going to get, instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, you'll get 1 or 70,000-1 stored, 73,000-2 stored, right? So conceptually, you're going to get a whole lot of compression the lower or less cardinal your columns are. Also consider the data type of your columns. Again, text doesn't compress the best. This really comes back to cardinality. When you're dealing with integers, generally you're gonna have like numbers that are like every single day you're gonna have a different sales number, right? That's gonna be hard to compress because the cardinality is so high. Every single row is gonna be probably different than the row above it. So you're not gonna get much compression out of it. So not really worth sorting that column if you're thinking of what to sort. And then lastly, consider if some columns naturally sort other columns, right? If you're dealing with subcategories or categories that have subcategories. You want to think through sorting by this, how is it going to affect the sorting of the other columns? And so you want to start with the ones that are going to influence the most sorting throughout your table. And then the final tip on that is remove your key columns if you don't need them. So oftentimes people have like a transaction key, which on your fact table you have this key which you're never ever going to reference. Keys are very, very hard to compress. You think about it, oftentimes keys are per row, and so there's no repeating values, so therefore no compression is available. Make sure you get rid of those columns if you don't need them.
Okay, so one of the other visualization tools that's really useful in a lot of different environments, different organizations, is bookmarks. Bookmarks, I've found in my experience that bookmarks typically have 2 uses most often. One of them being that it captures just a current view of a report page that includes the filtering and the state of all the visuals. So it's just kind of like a snapshot, if you will. And you can save that as a bookmark so that you can come back to it later. And oftentimes the other way is for storytelling or presentation type use cases where you want to, you're doing a presentation in a meeting with executives or stakeholders or what have you, and you want to go through kind of a series of insights that you've found during your analysis, where you can go through, you start on one report, you click on a bookmark to lead you to the next, and that helps your transition and presentation. So you can almost kind of create like a PowerPoint style presentation by using bookmarks.
Another really cool thing that bookmarks can do is you can create buttons on your page, like your report page inside of Power BI, and when somebody clicks on that button, you can have it toggle between different bookmarks. Mm-hmm. And so you can create the effect of like a little, on your iPhone or whatever phone you have, sometimes there's those little toggle, like turn your data on or off kind of buttons. You can create something like that in Power BI and have it switch between your different bookmarks. I've done that to show and hide additional slicers and filters for the page. So that way you can save your real estate, but show the filters when people need to change them, and then they can hide them again so you can see the whole page. That's another really cool thing with bookmarks.
Yeah, or it could be used to like see different parts of the business on the same page.
Mm-hmm.
Right, just bring up different views. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and there's actually a really cool feature with that as well. If you use drill through to get to the bookmark, you can enable or disable a function to where it will respect the data and filters and slicers that you have selected at that moment or not. The example that I've seen is where you go to drill through and you're looking at a map of just that one state that you clicked on to drill through. And then you click the toggle just like what you described, to see a list, a more specific list of transactions that fit that same criteria. But then when you toggle back to the map, you will either see everything again and remove the slicers, or you'll go back to only seeing the state that you selected.
Final tip we're going to give you today is one that has been a conundrum. The only reason I know about this is because I had a client that had this problem, and it took me a long time to figure out why this happened. And it's the issue with joining on dates. Sometimes when people join on dates, they will not change their date in their fact table to be date. It'll be date time. And then you have a date table. Hopefully you make a date table. If you don't, make sure you do. But when you create a relationship between your date table and the fact table on that date, if it's date time, it just breaks because your date table doesn't have date time, it's just dates. So then a lot of people say, oh, I'll just, in my desktop version, I'll change that column that's date time to date. And that, unfortunately, doesn't always work either. Okay, so in this file right here, what I've got is I've got this table, and this table is using a relationship in my model that goes from my date on my date table to my order date column in my sales order table. If I look at my sales order header order date, you can see right here it's a date time. Okay, and I know the numbers are wrong because this right here is not using the date table, it's using the year and month from the sales order header, so I know that's right. And you can see that the numbers are wrong. In 2018, I only have 4 million here, but where I'm supposed to have 101 million, and then vice versa. So there's something funky going on with the relationship, and it's just wrong. And so if I want to fix this, some of you might be tempted to come here and say, oh, let's just make this a date. You'll think, yeah, that'll do it. That should push it back to Power Query, right? And you come here and you think, oh, not so. It didn't change anything. Even though you changed the data type and it shows up as a date here, it does not change this at all. And so we have to go to Power Query itself and go to that sales order header table. I need to click on this right here so that it's got that calendar with the little clock in the bottom corner, and I need to make it date only. Replace current, that's replacing the current step right here that made it date time. So I just changed that order date to a date now, and when I hit close and apply, you'll see these numbers change, and now they match exactly. So you have to change in Power Query. If you're going to join on a date, make sure it's date in Power Query, not date time. And then the final tip that I had was for an Excel. So this is a Power BI file that I've connected to two different, or the same Excel file, but one of them, if you look at my Power Query, I connected to it from my computer. Now this file is stored in my OneDrive, okay? If I go to the source, you can see here that it's in my JourneyTEAM that's our SharePoint site. We have a business intelligence agency, and then we've got, it's in our training, right? And it's this data set right here. So that is in OneDrive, but because I've referenced it on my computer, when I publish it to the web and I try to schedule a refresh, in my schedule refresh, I come here and I've got my Excel SharePoint example. This is the file published. I've got one that's referencing a file on my computer and another one that uses the SharePoint folder connector inside of Power Query. And you'll notice when I hit Gateway Connection, it's going to require me to, before I can schedule a refresh, it's going to require me to connect the references to the file on my computer to a data gateway before I can refresh it at all. And that's kind of a pain because the file lives on OneDrive, which is online. It's a cloud source. And so you shouldn't have to have a data gateway. You shouldn't need a gateway in order to refresh that. And so the best way that I've found in order to get the same data is to host it in OneDrive. That's the best cloud source for Power BI. And to use the SharePoint connector, when you hit New Source and you go to More, there's a SharePoint folder connector here. When you click on that, you just have to put the link to the SharePoint folder in there. And then on the SharePoint source, you can see I've got the same exact table. And I just had to do a few extra steps to tell it which file, because there is no foldering in a SharePoint folder when you connect to like a site or your personal OneDrive. There's no foldering. It just has all the files and then tells you where it lives. But that's okay. It still is a cloud source. You connect to it, you get the same data you need, and you don't need a data gateway.
Thanks again for joining us for this Enhancing the Power of Your Power BI discussion. I'm Josh James.
I'm Jordan Johnson.
Nathan Gillian. And we by no means have covered everything there is to know about Power BI and enhancing the power of Power BI in this. It is a great software tool that is very complex. And if you have additional questions, feel free to shoot us a note at info@journeyteam.com and we'll be happy to get in contact with you.
All right, we've covered a lot of material today. Really grateful you've stuck with us this whole time. Just want to finish with a summary of what we talked about so that we can just put a bow on this.
Okay, so first thing, make sure that when you're joining your date tables that you're joining on date fields and not date time fields.
When you are joining, other than in the case of dates, use integers rather than text when you can.
Now, report pages can also be used as tooltips. Use them where necessary and useful.
You can show Power Apps within Power BI, and with that you can have some really cool functionality.
Exactly. Also, clean up your Power BI tenant by using one dataset for many reports.
Suggest using parameters when you're developing within Power Query so that you can easily switch your sources.
Exactly. And when it comes to visualizations, pie charts are good for 2 categories, but not really more than that. We can also do cross-report filtering through drill-throughs. That's a really good thing to apply when needed.
That's right. Remember, you want to compress your files as much as you can before you push it into Power BI. You want to do that within Power Query. Make sure you sort your columns and things like that.
You can also use data flows. They do have limitations, especially if you're a pro user, but they are very advantageous when it comes to refreshing your data.
Again, covered a lot of stuff. Wish we could have covered more, but we're still here. We're here beyond Business Technology Summit. Please reach out to us if you have more questions. We'd be happy to help you with anything and everything.
And stay safe out there. See ya.
Thanks again.